Welcome to the deep dive. I am so glad you're here with us today.
Glad to be here.
If you are, prepping for a deep level seminar or trying to fill in the really complex gaps of modern history, or if you're just insanely curious about how the geopolitical fault lines of our world are actually formed, you are in the exact right place.
Absolutely.
Because today we are setting the stage to explore one of the most debated, heavily analyzed, and consequential events of the entire 20th century. We're looking at the destruction of the Ottoman Armenian population.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. And history of this magnitude can be dense. I mean, it involves shifting borders, ancient religious laws, massive bureaucratic systems, and just unimaginable human experiences. But we are going to break down the mechanics of this history into clear insights.
Right.
We're searching for those structural aha moments without drowning you in raw data.
And to achieve that level of clarity, we really rely on the specific materials you've brought to us. Today, our entire structural analysis is built on a single, highly detailed source.
Yeah.
It's a comprehensive Wikipedia article detailing the Armenian Genocide.
And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the actual machinery of the event. We want to understand the timeline, sure, but more importantly, the mechanics of how a multi-ethnic empire operates under the intense pressure of a world war.
Yes.
We'll examine the staggering human cost, the monumental transfer of wealth that followed, and the century-long dispute over how this history is legally and historically defined today. We want to take you beyond just recognizing a historical term and really pull back the curtain on the geopolitical forces that were at play.
Well, before we step into the historical timeline, I need to establish a critical, non-negotiable ground rule for our discussion today.
Please do.
The source material we are examining today contains deeply politically charged content. It covers historical events that remain the subject of vastly differing, deeply entrenched national narratives.
Right. It's highly contested in different parts of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because of this reality, I want to make it abundantly clear to you, the listener, that our deep dive will strictly and impartially report on the content provided in the text. We are not taking a side. We are not endorsing any specific national or political viewpoint. Rather, we are acting purely as your guides to help you untangle the claims, the historical facts, the demographic statistics, and the competing perspectives exactly as they're laid out in the original source you provided.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp what unfolds in 1915, starting in 1915 is a massive mistake.
They're huge mistakes.
You have to understand the fabric of the society that existed before it was torn apart. So step back in time with us to the Ottoman Empire and the decades before the outbreak of World War I. We're talking about a sprawling, complex, multi-ethnic empire. Based on the source, what did the demographics actually look like on the eve of the war?
The demographic landscape is essential to visualizing the scale of what happens next. In 1914, the region of Anatolia, which is essentially the peninsula that forms the bulk of modern-day Turkey, had a total population hovering between 15 and 17.5 million people.
Okay.
Within that broader population, there were roughly 2 million Armenians, and their geographic distribution is a vital piece of the puzzle here.
Where were they mostly located?
The Armenian Patriarchate, which kept fairly meticulous records, estimated there were nearly 3,000 Armenian towns and villages spread across the empire. The vast majority of these were clustered in the eastern provinces, right in the Armenian highlands near the border with the Russian Empire.
But knowing where they lived doesn't really tell us how they lived.
No, it doesn't.
Because the Ottoman Empire wasn't a modern nation-state with equal citizenship. They organized their society using something called the millet system. How would you describe the reality of that system for the average Armenian? Because reading the source, it seems far more rigid than just, a massive diverse neighborhood with strict homeowner rules.
Oh, it was far more rigid. The millet system was fundamentally a legally enforced social hierarchy based entirely on religion. Under Islamic Sharia law, which governed the empire, non-Muslims were designated as dhimmis.
Dhimmis. It reminds me of a strictly enforced caste system, or like a form of legally mandated second-class citizenship where your entire legal existence is dictated by the church you attend.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. Being a dhimmi offered a specific, albeit limited, type of protection. It guaranteed their property rights and their freedom of worship. The Ottoman state allowed the Armenian Apostolic Church to manage its own internal community affairs.
Things like marriage, inheritance, education.
Exactly. But this autonomy came with a steep, non-negotiable price. In exchange for this protection, Armenians had to pay a special exemption tax. Their testimony in Islamic courts against a Muslim was heavily discounted or entirely inadmissible.
Wow.
They were generally forbidden from carrying weapons, and they had to legally and visibly accept a subordinate position to the Muslim majority.
So they are structurally vulnerable by design. And that vulnerability gets dangerously compounded by economics. The source introduces this concept of a middleman minority. We're talking about a population where the vast majority are peasant farmers in the east, but a highly visible segment of them are overrepresented in commerce and trade in the cities.
And that economic visibility creates a dangerous illusion. Because some Armenian merchants in places like Constantinople or Smyrna achieved a level of wealth and economic influence, it generated intense resentment among the Muslim majority.
Right.
But that wealth did not translate into political leverage or military power. They were a minority in almost every single province they lived in, surrounded by Turkish and Kurdish Muslim neighbors, as well as other Christian groups like the Greek Orthodox.
So you have wealth, or at least the perception of widespread wealth, combined with zero political power and a legal system that views you as inherently subordinate. That is a powder keg. If the political winds shift, there's absolutely nothing standing between that community and the state.
And the political winds shifted violently in the late 19th century.
How?
The Ottoman Empire was a state in terminal decline. It was losing territory in Europe, its economy was heavily indebted to European powers, and the government in Constantinople was desperately trying to centralize its authority just to survive. Part of that centralization involved trying to tax those Armenian peasants in the eastern provinces directly.
But the local power brokers, the Kurdish landlords and tribal leaders, they weren't just going to hand over their traditional spheres of influence, right?
Precisely. The Ottoman state abolished the local Kurdish emirates, but the Kurdish tribal chiefs simply continued to exact their own illegal taxes and forced labor from the Armenian peasants. So the Armenians were being squeezed relentlessly by both the central government's tax collectors and the local Kurdish landlords.
They were living in semi-feudal, highly abusive conditions.
Completely.
I noticed the source also highlights a massive demographic shift happening right on top of this economic squeeze. Starting in the mid-19th century, you have hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees flooding into the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
These are primarily Circassians who are fleeing the brutal Russo-Circassian War in the Caucasus. Where do they go? The Ottoman state starts actively settling them in the eastern provinces.
And they didn't just settle them on empty land. The state began systematically confiscating Armenian-owned agricultural land to give to these newly arrived Muslim immigrants.
Just taking it.
Just taking it. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate policy initiated under Sultan Abdulhamid II to alter the demographics of the eastern provinces. By increasing the Muslim population and actively reducing the Armenian landholdings, the state was trying to solidify its control over a volatile border region.
Which pushes this from a purely domestic crisis into the international spotlight. Let's look at 1878. The Ottoman Empire has just suffered a catastrophic defeat in a war against the Russian Empire. They are forced to the negotiating table of the Congress of Berlin, and the great powers of Europe essentially insert themselves into Ottoman domestic policy.
The Congress of Berlin is the geopolitical turning point for the Armenian question. At this Congress, the European powers forced the Ottoman government to sign a treaty guaranteeing the physical safety of its Armenian subjects against the abuses of the Kurdish tribes and local officials.
But reading through the source, that guarantee feels completely hollow.
It was.
There was no enforcement mechanism. The European powers didn't station peacekeepers there. They just put words on a piece of paper and walked away.
It was entirely hollow in terms of protection, but its psychological impact on the Ottoman leadership was devastating. By internationalizing the issue, the Congress of Berlin convinced the Ottoman authorities that the Armenians were no longer just a subordinate religious community. They were suddenly viewed as a severe internal security threat.
Like a fifth column.
Exactly, a potential fifth column that could be used by hostile foreign powers, specifically Russia or Britain, as a pretext to invade and carve up the empire.
Sultan Abdulhamid II's reaction to this paranoia is terrifying. Instead of reforming the system, he doubles down on the violence. He creates the Hamidi regiments in 1891. What exactly were these units? because they don't sound like a standard imperial army.
They weren't. The Hamidi regiments were state-sponsored, irregular cavalry units made up almost entirely of Kurdish tribesmen. The Sultan essentially armed the very people who were already oppressing the Armenians, gave them uniforms, and granted them total legal impunity to act on behalf of the state.
Wow.
It was a massive escalation of state terror.
And that terror is unleashed between 1894 and 1896 in what are now known as the Hamidian massacres. The numbers are staggering. The source indicates that at least 100,000 Armenians were killed.
Yeah, at least.
Entire villages were destroyed, forced conversions to Islam were widespread, and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, fleeing to cities or leaving the empire entirely.
The historical consensus presented in the text makes a crucial point about the motive behind the 1890s massacres. This wasn't a spontaneous outbreak of ethnic hatred, nor was it the later genocide we see in 1915. It was a calculated, brutal attempt by the Ottoman state to violently restore the old social order.
Put them back in their place.
Exactly. The Armenians had dared to ask for equal rights and European protection, so the state utilized extreme violence to force them back into their subordinate dhimmi status and to deliberately reduce their demographic weight in the eastern provinces.
So the environment is utterly toxic. You have institutional paranoia, unchecked paramilitary violence, and a severely traumatized population.
Yeah.
But then out of nowhere, there's this massive geopolitical plot twist in 1908.
The Young Turk Revolution.
Yes, a secret society known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or the CUP, successfully overthrows Sultan Abdul Hamid's despotic rule. They restore the 1876 constitution, they bring back the parliament.
And the initial reaction across the empire is genuine euphoria. The revolution was celebrated by Ottomans of all ethnicities and religions. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were suddenly embracing in the streets. Even the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the ARF, which was the main Armenian political party, actually allied with the CUP during the revolution.
Wait, if the ARF and the CUP were actively allied in 1908 to restore a pluralistic constitution, how on earth do we get from a democratic celebration to total eradication in just 6 or 7 years? Was that alliance a complete facade, or did something break the system?
It wasn't a facade initially. There was a genuine, albeit fragile, hope for an Ottomanist identity, a shared civic identity that superseded religion. But what broke the system was a catastrophic external trauma. In 1912, the First Balkan War erupts.
Right.
An alliance of Balkan states attacks the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans suffer a rapid, humiliating defeat. They lose almost all of their remaining territory in Europe.
I can't even imagine the psychological shock of that to a centuries-old imperial power, to have the very birthplace of your empire stripped away in a matter of months.
The psychological shock was profound, but the demographic shock was immediate and visceral. The loss of the Balkans resulted in the mass, violent expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Muslims. These refugees, who had suffered horrific atrocities at the hands of the victorious Christian Balkan armies, flooded into the remaining Ottoman territory in Anatolia. They were traumatized, destitute, and furious.
And their arrival completely shatters any remaining hope for that shared Ottomanist identity. The source notes that the Ottoman Muslim public became intensely radicalized. They projected their rage over the atrocities in the Balkans onto all Christians within the empire.
Precisely. And this is where the CUP leadership, figures like Talaat Pasha, who was the Minister of the Interior, and Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, fundamentally alter their ideology. The dream of coexistence was dead.
So what did they turn to?
To save the remnants of the state, they embraced a radical, exclusionary form of Turkish nationalism. They looked at the map of Anatolia, which they viewed as the absolute final sanctuary for the Turkish nation, and they saw the non-Muslim populations, particularly the Greeks and the Armenians, as existential threats.
The source uses a chilling phrase to describe how the CUP viewed these minority communities. They saw them as internal tumors that needed to be excised before they could destroy the host body. And they viewed the Armenians as the most dangerous of all, not because they were actively rebelling, but because their historical homeland was right there, in eastern Anatolia.
The CUP's fear was entirely structural. They believed that if the empire faced another major crisis, the Armenians, backed by Russia, would push for an independent state in eastern Anatolia, exactly like the Balkan nations had just done in Europe. If that happened, the Turkish nation would lose its final refuge.
So by 1914, the paranoia is completely institutionalized. The leadership is radicalized, the public is inflamed by the refugee crisis, and the state apparatus is controlled by a group of men who view their own citizens as a demographic time bomb. The stage is set, and the crisis that ignites it is World War I.
In August 1914, the Ottoman Empire signs a secret alliance with the German Empire. By late October, they officially enter the Great War by launching a naval attack on Russian ports in the Black Sea.
Which leads almost immediately to a military disaster. Let's look at the Caucasus front. Winter of 1914 to 1915. Minister of War Enver Pasha decides he is a military genius and takes personal command of the Ottoman Third Army. He plans a highly complex encirclement of the Russian forces at the Battle of Sarıkamış.
And it was a spectacular failure. Enver completely underestimated the brutal winter conditions of the Caucasus Mountains. His supply lines collapsed, his troops froze to death in the snow, and his army was routed by the Russians. He lost upwards of 60,000 men.
60,000.
It was a humiliating, catastrophic defeat for a leader who had built his reputation on military prowess.
But Enver doesn't return to Constantinople and admit he made a strategic error. He needs a scapegoat for his narcissistic injury. So he publicly blames his defeat on the Armenians. He claims that Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman army deserted and that the Armenian civilian population actively colluded with the Russians to sabotage his campaign.
When reading through the historical analysis, it is critical to understand how this false narrative was constructed. Were there some Armenians across the border fighting in the Russian army? Yes. Were there isolated incidents of desertion or local friction? Yes. But the CUP leadership took these isolated, scattered incidents and weaponized them. They actively ignored the intelligence reports confirming that the vast majority of the Armenian population and the Armenian political leadership remained loyal and were contributing to the Ottoman war effort.
They didn't want the truth. They wanted confirmation of their paranoia. They used the disaster at Sarıkamış as definitive proof of a massive, coordinated, empire-wide Armenian conspiracy.
And that confirmation bias created an impossible lethal situation on the ground. We can see this dynamic perfectly encapsulated in the province of Van in April 1915. Van had a significant Armenian population and was governed by Cevdet Bey, who was actually the brother-in-law of Enver Pasha. Cevdet Bey had already been overseeing massacres of Armenian men in the surrounding villages for months.
So the Armenians in the city of Van know exactly what he is capable of. And then Cevdet Bey issues an order. He demands that the Armenians of Van hand over their weapons and supply men for labor battalions. This is the ultimate terrifying catch-22.
It is a deliberate provocation. If the Armenians obey the order, disarm, and hand over their able-bodied men, they are absolutely certain they will be slaughtered, just like the surrounding villages.
Yes.
But if they refuse to disarm and choose to defend themselves, they provide Cevdet Bey with the exact optical pretext the central government wants: armed Armenians defying the state.
They chose to fight for their lives. They barricaded themselves in the Armenian quarter and successfully repelled the initial Ottoman assaults, starting around April 20th. They managed to hold out for weeks until Russian forces arrived and relieved the siege in mid-May. But the victory, if you can even call it that, was surrounded by total devastation.
When the Russian army arrived, they found roughly 55,000 corpses in the Van province. Cevdet Bey's forces, unable to break the siege of the city itself, had systematically annihilated the Armenian villages throughout the surrounding countryside. Approximately half the pre-war Armenian population of the province was murdered in a matter of weeks.
But the truly horrific part of the Van resistance is how the Ottoman government manipulated it. The central government in Constantinople didn't view Van as a desperate act of self-defense against a rogue governor. They framed it as the opening salvo of a nationwide Armenian revolution. They broadcasted the events at Van as absolute proof that the internal tumor had ruptured.
Which brings us to a date that is recognized globally: April 24th, 1915. Using the resistance at Van as his primary justification, Minister of the Interior Talaat Pasha issues an order that changes the course of history.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is often referred to as Red Sunday. What exactly happened on that day in Constantinople?
Talaat Pasha ordered the immediate arrest of the Armenian elite in the capital. Hundreds of political leaders, intellectuals, journalists, doctors, and clergy were rounded up in the middle of the night.
I have to ask about the strategy here. If the government is terrified of a widespread rebellion in the eastern provinces, why do they start by arresting journalists and poets in the capital city hundreds of miles away?
Because it was a highly calculated decapitation strike. By eliminating the intellectual and political leadership first, Talaat Pasha was systematically removing anyone who had the organizational capacity, the political connections, or the international voice to coordinate resistance or appeal to the European powers. They were rendering the broader Armenian population completely leaderless. The vast majority of those arrested on April 24th and in subsequent sweeps were eventually murdered in holding camps.
And on that very same day, April 24th, Talaat Pasha also officially bans all Armenian political organizations and orders the first major deportations. He decrees that Armenians who had already been relocated within central Anatolia must be moved again, this time far to the south, into the Syrian desert.
This is where we see the transition from targeted political violence to empire-wide structural eradication. But to uproot millions of people across a vast mountainous terrain with limited infrastructure, you need more than just secret police. You need the full weight of the state bureaucracy.
You need paperwork. You need a legal framework. In May 1915, the Ottoman Council of Ministers passes what is known as the Temporary Law of Deportation, or the Tessier Law. This law fundamentally empowers the military and provincial governors to deport anyone they suspect of treason or espionage.
The phrasing of the law is critical. It never explicitly mentions the word Armenians. It is cloaked in the bureaucratic language of military necessity and wartime security. This provided the government with complete legal cover to execute their plans under the guise of counterinsurgency.
But the true genius, and I use that word to describe the sheer, terrifying efficiency of the evil here, is how they communicated the actual intent behind the law. The source details a system of dual-track communication utilized by the CUP. How did this work in practice?
The dual-track telegraph system is one of the most chilling aspects of the genocide's organization. On the first track, the Ministry of the Interior sent official coded telegrams to provincial governors. These telegrams use relatively benign bureaucratic language. They ordered the relocation or deportation of the Armenian populations, instructing officials to protect their property and ensure their safe transport. These were the telegrams meant to be preserved in the official state archives, providing plausible deniability to the international community.
Right, a history book track.
Yeah.
But what of the second track?
The second track operated entirely outside the official state apparatus. These messages were sent through the secret internal channels of the CUP party itself. These telegrams contained the criminal orders, explicit instructions for the annihilation of the convoys, the massacre of the men, and the orchestration of the death marches.
Wow.
And the absolute most important instruction attached to every single one of these second-track telegrams was that they had to be destroyed immediately upon receipt and reading.
It's the ultimate bureaucratic shadow government. The governor receives a telegram saying, "Please safely relocate the Armenians of this province." An hour later, a party loyalist hands him a secret message saying, "Ensure none of them survive the journey. Burn this paper." It is staggering to think about the level of coordination that requires.
And that coordination manifested in the brutal, systematic logistics of the deportations. The text is very clear on this point. Deportation was not a byproduct of war that went wrong. It was explicitly designed to be a death sentence. The authorities planned for and intended the death of the deportees from the moment they left their homes.
Let's walk through exactly how these deportations were carried out, because the sheer mechanics of the eradication are difficult to comprehend. The source indicates that the state used a very specific demographic sequencing.
They did. By 1915, at least 10% of the Ottoman Armenian population had already been conscripted into the Ottoman army. This meant that the Armenian towns and villages were largely bereft of fighting-age men to begin with. Those men who had been conscripted were subsequently disarmed and transferred into brutal labor battalions, where most were either worked to death or executed.
So the communities are already highly vulnerable. When the deportation orders arrive in a village, what happens to the men and older boys who are still there?
They were dealt with immediately. The CUP leadership wanted to avoid the chaotic, destructive violence of the 1890s massacres. They didn't want property destroyed or unauthorized looting because, as we will discuss, that property was earmarked for the state. Therefore, the authorities typically separated the men, and boys, sometimes as young as 12, from the women and children during the very first few days of the march.
And the text notes a heartbreaking detail. Very few of these men actively resisted their arrest or separation. Why? Because they believed that if they fought back, the soldiers would immediately slaughter their wives and children. They complied to buy time for their families.
Once separated, these men were marched out of town and systematically executed. And the choice of execution sites reveals the intense logistical planning involved. The authorities didn't just shoot them by the side of the road, they marched them to specific geographical features. Deep gorges, remote mountain passes, hidden wells, or large rivers and lakes.
They needed terrain that would do the work of concealing the sheer volume of corpses.
Exactly. The killings were often carried out by paramilitaries, frequently units of the Special Organization.
Let's pause on the Special Organization for a second. We've mentioned them a few times. Who exactly were these units? Were they regular army?
No, the special organization, the Teşkilat Masusa, was a covert paramilitary network established by the CUP, operating directly under the Ministry of War. While some officers were regular military, many of the rank-and-file members utilized for the massacres were irregulars, Kurdish tribesmen, and significantly violent criminals who had been specifically released from state prisons for the express purpose of attacking the Armenian convoys. They operated with total impunity, entirely outside the bounds of military law.
That is deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
You empty your prisons to build an extermination force. And the scale of their work is almost unquantifiable, but the source gives us specific historical accounts that provide a glimpse. We have the testimony of the United States consul in the region, Leslie Davis. What did he report?
In September 1915, Consul Davis traveled to Lake Hazar, which was near his post in Harput. He reported discovering the remains of nearly 10,000 Armenians in the vicinity. He saw hundreds of corpses floating in the water and filling the deep ravines around the lake. The special organization paramilitaries had systematically marched groups of men to the cliffs and pushed them into the gorge or the water.
The rivers themselves became weapons of mass disposal. The text describes how the Tigris and the Euphrates, the absolute lifeblood rivers of the region, literally became choked with the dead. So many bodies were thrown into the water that they formed massive, rotting dams that blocked the river flow. The authorities actually had to use explosives to clear the body jams.
The environmental and public health impact was catastrophic. Those rotting corpses floated hundreds of miles south, reaching as far as the Persian Gulf. They caused severe downstream pollution and triggered massive disease epidemics that affected the general population long after the immediate massacres were over.
With the men systematically eliminated within the first few days, the convoys were now made up almost entirely of women, children, and the elderly. What was their fate on these marches?
Their fate was a prolonged, agonizing destruction. These convoys were forced to march hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 kilometers, entirely on foot. They were pushed through rugged, mountainous terrain and vast deserts during the absolute peak of the summer heat.
And the text makes it clear they were actively deprived of the basic necessities of life. This wasn't a failure of logistics. It was the weaponization of the environment. The guards deliberately kept them away from water sources and denied them food.
It was an endurance march designed to kill. Furthermore, the convoys were not safe during the journey. They were repeatedly stopped at transit camps where the gendarme escorts or local militias would essentially hold them hostage. They demanded exorbitant ransoms. If a family couldn't pay, members were taken away and murdered. If a woman or child collapsed from exhaustion and couldn't keep up with the column, they were shot on the spot or left to die of exposure.
The survival rates for these marches, particularly from the more remote regions, are zero. The source explicitly points out that convoys originating from the easternmost provinces of Anatolia were eliminated almost in their entirety before they ever reached the desert. For example, it is estimated that 99% of the Armenians deported from the province of Erzurum never arrived at their destination. 99%.
While physical annihilation was the primary tool, it was not the only method of destruction. What's fascinating here is that we must examine another crucial mechanism detailed in the source, one that goes beyond just killing, the policy of forced Islamization.
I want to spend significant time on this because it challenges a lot of preconceived notions about what genocide looks like. We often think of it solely as mass murder, but the text argues that Islamization wasn't just a chaotic byproduct of the marches, it was a deeply structural component of the Ottoman state's policy.
It was a bureaucratic machine in its own right. The estimates in the source suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 Armenians were forcibly converted to Islam during this period. The state utilized its entire apparatus, the police, the judiciary, the local clergy, to facilitate and record these conversions.
Why, though? If the ultimate goal is the eradication of the Armenian presence, why expend state resources to convert them instead of just killing them?
Because the goal of the CUP leadership, above all else, was demographic engineering. Talaat, Pasha, and the leadership were obsessed with population statistics. They determined that if the Armenian population in any given area was kept below a strictly enforced threshold of 5 to 10% of the total Muslim population, they would lose their cultural cohesion. They would be unable to maintain their language, their traditions, or any political aspirations. They would simply dissolve into the broader Turkish and Kurdish Muslim society.
It's forced assimilation at the point of a sword. And Talaat Pasha was personally micromanaging this. The source mentions he was reviewing the statistics and tracking the loyalty of these newly converted populations right up until the end of the war.
Conversion required total erasure. It wasn't just reciting a prayer, it meant the immediate eradication of your given Armenian name. You were assigned a new Muslim name. You were forbidden from speaking the Armenian language. For women, it almost universally meant forced marriage into a Muslim household.
The reality of what happened to the women and girls is profoundly disturbing. The text states that young women and girls were routinely abducted from the convoys by local tribesmen, officials, or the guards themselves. They were appropriated as unpaid house servants or forced into sexual slavery. The source even notes that deported women were stripped naked, paraded through the streets of Damascus, and sold in public slave markets, with some victims eventually ending up as far away as North Africa, in places like Tunisia or Algeria.
The CUP government implicitly and often explicitly allowed this to happen. Why? Because from a cold demographic perspective, a woman absorbed into a Muslim household, bearing children who would be raised as Muslims, ceased to be a demographic threat. Her Armenian identity was structurally annihilated.
And what happened to the children who were orphaned on the marches or whose parents were forced to give them away in desperate hopes of keeping them alive?
The state was highly proactive regarding the children. They didn't just leave them to wander. The Ottoman government established specialized state-run orphanages. But these were not humanitarian institutions, they were assimilation factories. The procedures were strict and intentional. Strip the child of their Armenian name, forbid them from speaking their mother tongue, and forcefully indoctrinate them into Turkish Muslim culture.
Let's stop and really look at the grand strategy here. By killing the men, absorbing the women into Muslim households, and placing the children in state-run assimilation camps, the Ottoman state was ensuring that even if individuals survived, the Armenian people could never reconstitute themselves as a nation within Anatolia. It is the absolute structural dismantling of an identity.
And that structural dismantling opens the door to another massive, highly organized component of the genocide, the economic revolution.
So what does this all mean economically? This is a point that absolutely floored me in the source. We've talked about the paranoia, the nationalism, the demographic engineering. But what does this all mean for the physical towns, the farms, the businesses left behind? The text argues that a major secondary motivation for the genocide was the intentional destruction of the Armenian bourgeoisie to clear the path for a new Turkish Muslim middle class.
To achieve this, the government couldn't rely on chaotic looting. They needed a legal mechanism to orchestrate a massive transfer of capital. Between 1915 and 1917, the Ottoman government, and later the nationalist movement, passed a complex series of decrees collectively known as the Abandoned Properties Laws.
Abandoned? As if the owners just went on vacation and forgot to come back.
Exactly. The official public stance of the law was that the state was merely acting as a temporary caretaker. They claimed they were administering the properties, selling off perishable goods, and holding the capital in trust until the Armenians eventually returned from their relocation. But the internal reality, as explicitly detailed in the historical analysis, was that there was absolutely no provision ever made to return these properties. The legal presumption baked into the system was that the owners had ceased to exist.
So who gets the land? Who gets the houses and the bank accounts?
The distribution was incredibly systematic and served multiple state goals. First, prime agricultural land and homes were given to the hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees who were still streaming in from the Balkans and the Caucasus. This solved a massive housing and social crisis for the government. Second, commercial businesses, factories, and significant capital were handed over to local Muslim elites and loyalists of the CUP party.
The source also points out that the perpetrators themselves were highly financially motivated. The government decreed that those participating in the massacres or deportations were legally entitled to keep a third of all the movable property, jewelry, cash, livestock, that they could strip from the Armenians. The rest went to the local authorities and the central government.
Let's pull back and look at the so what of this economic shift. This isn't just about stealing watches, this is macroeconomics. The capital that was stripped from the Armenian population literally funded the logistical costs of the deportations themselves. And historians in the text make an even more profound argument regarding the long-term impact. The profound insight here is that the creation of the modern Republic of Turkey and the establishment of its new national legal and economic system was fundamentally capitalized by this dispossession. By eliminating the Armenian commercial class, the state violently cleared the economic ladder, allowing lower-class Turks to rise up and form a new, loyal middle class. The wealth seized during the genocide provided the foundational capital base that built the post-1923 republic. It was, quite literally, an economic revolution enacted through mass murder.
Okay, we need to transition back to the human reality of the survivors. For those who somehow endured the death marches, who survived the starvation, the diseases, and the special organization, where did they end up?
The primary destination for the convoys was the Syrian desert. The earliest arrivals, in the midsummer of 1915, were initially directed to the city of Aleppo, which became the main transit hub. But as the sheer volume of deportees swelled, the authorities began redirecting the convoys deeper into the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Upper Mesopotamia to areas surrounding Deir ez-Zor and Ras Al Ain.
The numbers arriving are staggering, despite the massive death toll on the roads. By October 1915, the text notes that approximately 870,000 deportees had reached Syria. But arriving at these destinations was in no way a salvation. The Ottoman authorities didn't set up refugee camps with food and medicine. They established a sprawling network of concentration camps.
And the administrative strategy within these camps was deliberately engineered to cause death. The authorities utilized a system of constant forced transfers. They would hold a group of tens of thousands of deportees in one camp for a few weeks, allowing disease and starvation to take hold, and then they would suddenly order them to march to another camp miles away,
keeping them in a state of perpetual motion so they can never build shelters, never find a stable food source, and never recover their strength.
Precisely. The camps were effectively open-air death zones. With absolutely no sanitation, no clean water, and no rations provided by the state, epidemics raged out of control. Dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia decimated the populations. Hundreds of people were dying daily in these transit hubs, purely from starvation and preventable diseases.
But the text highlights a really twisted paradox facing the Ottoman Empire at this exact moment. They are actively engaged in a multi-front world war. They are trying to run railroads, manufacture uniforms, and supply armies. And they suddenly realize they have systematically eradicated the very skilled labor force they desperately need to run their war economy.
This is the immense contradiction of the policy. The Ottoman military command realized that the total annihilation of the Armenians was crippling their logistics. Consequently, they instituted temporary reprieves. Some Armenians, specifically skilled artisans, railway workers, and engineers, were pulled out of the convoys and forced into slave labor battalions for the military.
The source notes that as the British Army advanced into the region later in the war, they actually liberated between 100,000 and 150,000 Armenians who had been working in these abysmal, vital conditions for the Ottoman military.
But for the hundreds of thousands languishing in the Syrian camps, those temporary reprieves meant nothing. Despite the horrific conditions, the survival instinct of the Armenian deportees was far stronger than the CUP leadership anticipated. A loosely organized clandestine resistance network actually formed in Aleppo, managing to smuggle some food and money to the camps. By the beginning of 1916, against all odds, there were still roughly 500,000 deportees clinging to life in Syria and Mesopotamia.
Which triggers an incredibly dark reaction from the leadership in Constantinople. Minister of the Interior Talaat Pasha looks at those survival numbers and panics. He isn't relieved, he is terrified. Why? Because he fears that if the war ends, these 500,000 survivors will simply walk back to Anatolia and reclaim their homes.
Talaat's solution to that fear was the initiation of a second wave of genocide. In February 1916, he issued a new set of orders aimed squarely at liquidating the remaining camp populations. Between March and October of 1916, local officials and paramilitaries executed a massive, systematic slaughter.
The text notes, they specifically marched tens of thousands of people into the remote desert regions near Deir ez-Zor. They didn't want the bodies piling up near the railways or towns because it would create a public health hazard for the Ottoman troops.
In that second wave alone, historians estimate that more than 200,000 Armenians who had miraculously survived the initial marches and the first winter in the camps were massacred. By the end of 1916, the camp system was effectively emptied.
I have to ask the question that always comes up when discussing atrocities on this scale. What did the rest of the world know? We're in an era of telegraphs and global newspapers. Could the Ottoman Empire really keep the murder of 1 million people a secret?
They certainly tried. The Ottoman government implemented strict censorship laws. They expressly forbade the taking of photographs, and they repeatedly threatened foreign journalists and missionaries with arrest or expulsion if they attempted to document the convoys or the massacres.
But the truth leaked out anyway.
It poured out. You had hundreds of foreign consuls, missionaries, and engineers working on projects like the Baghdad Railway who witnessed the atrocities daily. They smuggled reports back to their home countries. Substantiated, highly detailed reports of the mass killings were splashed across the front pages of major Western newspapers. Witness testimonies were hastily compiled and published in books, generating massive public awareness.
And the international diplomatic response was surprisingly swift, even if it lacked teeth. The source highlights that on May 24, 1915, just a month after the arrest of the intellectuals, the Triple Entente powers, which were Russia, Great Britain, and France, issued a formal joint declaration.
That declaration is historically significant. It formally condemned the actions of the Ottoman Empire, and it utilized a specific legal phrasing for the very first time in diplomatic history. They accused the Ottoman government of committing crimes against humanity and civilization. The Entente Towers publicly vowed to hold the Ottoman leadership personally responsible for these crimes once the war was over.
The public response was equally massive. When people in the West read these reports, relief organizations sprang into action almost immediately. The text specifically highlights the monumental work of a group called Near East Relief in the United States.
Near East Relief orchestrated one of the largest humanitarian aid campaigns in history up to that point. Between 1915 and 1930, they managed to raise approximately $110 million to aid the refugees and orphans fleeing the Ottoman Empire.
I was looking at the scale of that relief effort. In 1915 money, $110 million is staggering. What does that translate to in modern currency?
Adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of well over $2 billion today.
$2 billion raised primarily from private citizens. The source mentions campaigns like Golden Rule Sundays, where American families would voluntarily eat the meager, restricted diet of an Armenian refugee for their Sunday dinner and then donate the money they saved on groceries to the relief fund. It shows a profound level of global empathy.
However, the international picture is incomplete without examining the deeply controversial role of the Ottoman Empire's closest military ally, the German Empire.
Right. Germany had immense military and economic influence in Constantinople. Did they try to stop it?
The German response was characterized by complicity and prioritization of their war aims. Early in 1915, German diplomats actually gave their tacit approval for limited removals of Armenians from sensitive military zones, accepting the Ottoman argument of military necessity. However, as the scale of the annihilation became undeniable and German consuls began sending frantic reports detailing the outright extermination, the German high command refused to intervene. They prioritized keeping the Ottoman Empire in the war over intervening to stop the genocide. They took absolutely no meaningful diplomatic or military action to halt the deportations.
So we pushed through the agonizing final years of the war. By late 1918, the guns finally fall silent. The Ottoman Empire is defeated, and the CUP leadership is in disgrace. Let's look at the sheer, devastating arithmetic of the aftermath. What is the final toll?
Calculating exact figures in the wake of such systematic destruction is historically complex, but the consensus presented in the source is clear. Both contemporary officials and modern historians estimate that between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians perished. The most widely cited and accepted figure is around 1 million dead.
And the geopolitical map of the region has been utterly shattered. The Russian Empire collapsed into the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which caused the Russian army to completely abandon the Caucasus front. This allowed Ottoman forces to push forward into Russian territory. In the power vacuum left behind, the surviving Armenians declared the First Republic of Armenia in May 1918.
But this new republic was born into absolute catastrophe. It was entirely landlocked, its infrastructure was ruined, and its demographics were unmanageable. 50% of its population consisted of traumatized, starving refugees who had fled the massacres in Anatolia. Furthermore, the Ottoman army still occupied 60% of the republic's claimed territory.
The conditions in the republic were apocalyptic. The text details how the Turkish troops enacted a blockade, preventing any food from entering the country, and deliberately destroyed the agricultural crops as they retreated. The result was a devastating famine. In the year 1918 alone, it is estimated that at least 200,000 people within this tiny new Armenian republic died from starvation or rampant typhus epidemics.
Yet, amidst that apocalyptic famine, the source details one of the most incredible structural efforts of survival and recovery, a campaign known as Vorpahavek, which translates to the gathering of orphans.
I want to focus on this because it highlights the cultural resilience required after a genocide. We discuss how thousands of Armenian women and children have been forcibly assimilated into Muslim households. When the war ended, Armenian leaders, clergy, and relief workers launched a massive, coordinated effort to find them and bring them back.
The logistical and cultural hurdles were immense. These children had been given new names. Many no longer remembered how to speak Armenian. And legally, under traditional patriarchal rules, a child's identity was derived entirely from their father. This meant that a child born to an Armenian woman who had been forced to marry a Muslim man was technically considered Muslim and Turkish.
But the Armenian leadership made a radical decision. They recognized that adhering to traditional patrilineal rules would mean losing an entire generation. So they completely abandoned those ancient rules. They decreed that any child born to an Armenian mother, regardless of who the father was, would be recognized and embraced as Armenian.
It was a massive effort of national reclamation. The scale of the orphan crisis they uncovered was unprecedented. In the city of Alexandropol alone, relief workers established an orphanage complex that housed 25,000 children simultaneously, the largest single orphanage in recorded world history. The Armenian Patriarchate in Constantinople reported that they were actively caring for over 100,000 rescued orphans, and they estimated that at least another 100,000 remained trapped in captivity across the region.
With the survivors attempting to rebuild amidst the ruins, the focus of the international community and of the defeated Ottoman state itself turned to accountability. The Entente powers had promised justice in 1915, and initially it looked like they might actually get it. In 1919, the new post-war Ottoman government convened the Ottoman Special Military Tribunals.
The politics behind these tribunals are fascinating. The new government, led by Grand Vizier Damat Friad Pasha, wasn't necessarily holding these trials out of a deep moral awakening. They were facing the victorious Allied powers, who were threatening to partition and dissolve the entire Ottoman Empire. The Grand Vizier's strategy was to publicly admit the atrocities, but to pin the entire genocide solely onto the small cadre of the CUP leadership.
He wanted to amputate the leadership, to save the imperial body. The text notes that he publicly, on the record, recognized that 800,000 Ottoman citizens of Armenian origin had died as a direct result of state policy. He famously declared that humanity would forever shudder at the magnitude of the tragedy.
The tribunals gathered extensive evidence. They collected authentic, original telegrams detailing the annihilation orders. They heard testimonies from Ottoman military commanders, and they unequivocally ruled that the deportations were a massive, premeditated campaign of mass murder orchestrated by the top tier of the CUP. Ultimately, the court sentenced 18 primary perpetrators to death,
including the masterminds, Talaat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. They are handed the death penalty. But there is a massive catch.
Yes, the primary architects of the genocide were tried in absentia. In the chaotic final days of the war leading up to the armistice, Talaat, Enver, and the rest of the inner circle had boarded a German torpedo boat and fled the capital in the dead of night. They had successfully escaped to Europe. Only 3 lower-level officials who remained in the country were actually executed.
The masterminds escaped the gallows. They slip away to live comfortable lives in exile while millions of survivors are starving. Which leads to what reads like an absolute spy thriller, but is entirely historical fact: Operation Nemesis.
Frustrated by the failure of international law to capture the leadership, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation decided to bypass the courts and enact justice themselves. They launched a highly secretive, covert assassination program named Operation Nemesis, after the Greek goddess of retribution.
Their goal was to hunt down the architects of the genocide who were hiding across Europe and the former Russian Empire. And the climax of this operation takes place on the streets of Berlin. Walk us through March 15th, 1921.
A young Armenian survivor and activist named Soghomon Talerian had been tracking Talaat Pasha, who was living under an assumed name in an upscale neighborhood in Berlin. On the morning of March 15, Talerian approached Talaat on the street, pulled out a revolver, and shot him dead at point-blank range.
Talerian doesn't run. He waits for the police. He freely admits that he pulled the trigger. But the trial of Soghomon Talerian turns into one of the most remarkable legal events of the century.
It did. Talerian's defense team essentially put Talaat Pasha and the genocide itself on trial. Over 2 days, they presented harrowing evidence of the massacres, the death marches, and Talaat's direct, undeniable culpability. They brought in survivor testimonies and German military officers who had witnessed the atrocities.
And the result stunned the world. After hearing the full scope of the horrors orchestrated by Talaat Pasha, the German jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned a verdict of not guilty. They acquitted the assassin.
The acquittal was a massive media sensation, but back in Anatolia, the political reality was taking a dramatic, violent turn. The CUP network hadn't simply disappeared when their leaders fled. The mid-level officers, the provincial governors, and the paramilitaries had regrouped. They formed the core of the new Turkish nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal.
And this nationalist movement launches the Turkish War of Independence to expel foreign forces and establish a new state. But the source makes a very explicit connection between the genocide and this new war. Who exactly was funding and supporting the nationalist army?
The nationalist movement relied heavily on the very same people who had orchestrated the deportations, and crucially the people who had wildly profited from the confiscation of Armenian property.
Let's stop and connect those dots. For these local elites and nationalist fighters, the prospect of the Armenian survivors returning home wasn't just a political problem. It was an existential financial threat. If the Armenians return, they will demand their farms back, they will demand their bank accounts back, and they will demand the prosecution of the murderers who are now living in their houses.
Exactly. So the nationalist movement viewed the surviving Armenians and the existence of the First Republic of Armenia on their border as a mortal threat to their new ethno-national ambitions and their newly acquired wealth. The historian Raymond Kevorkian, cited in the text, argues compellingly that the War of Independence was actively intended to complete the genocide by eradicating the remaining minority populations once and for all.
And they act on that intent. In 1920, the nationalist Turkish army launches an invasion of the fragile Armenian Republic. Their military orders, which were later uncovered, were explicit. Their objective was to eliminate Armenia physically and politically.
During this campaign, nationalist forces massacred nearly 100,000 more Armenians in the Transcaucasia region. Simultaneously, another 100,000 Armenians who had attempted to return to their homes in the southern region of Cilicia under French protection were attacked and forced to flee permanently.
The nationalists are victorious. They expel the Allied powers, they crush the remaining minority presence, and in 1923, they declare the modern Republic of Turkey. The Treaty of Lausanne is signed, establishing Turkey's current international borders.
And critically, the Treaty of Lausanne granted total amnesty to the perpetrators of the genocide. Any prior international demands for war crimes tribunals or minority protections were completely abandoned by the European powers in exchange for peace and access to trade. The text notes that any legal provisions for minority rights in the treaty were totally disregarded by the new Turkish state in practice.
The door is slammed shut. The survivors realize they can never go home. The Armenian people are now fundamentally scattered. The source outlines that roughly 295,000 found refuge in what became Soviet Armenia. About 200,000 formed the massive new diaspora in the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. And a small remnant stayed inside Turkey, primarily women and children who had been fully assimilated.
Which brings us to the profound legacy of these events and the intense century-long battle over historical memory that continues to define the topic today. The text notes that in the decades following the events, the destruction of the Armenians achieved an iconic status globally. It was widely viewed as the absolute apex of horrors conceivable by a modern state prior to World War II.
The horror was so unprecedented that it actually forced the creation of a new legal concept. Let's talk about Raphael Lemkin.
Raphael Lemkin was a Polish-Jewish legal scholar. In the 1920s, as a student, he read about the assassination of Talaat Pasha in Berlin and the subsequent trial of Talleyrand. He was profoundly disturbed by a massive loophole in international law. He realized that it was a crime for one man to kill another man, but there was absolutely no law, and indeed no word, to describe a sovereign state deciding to systematically murder millions of its own citizens.
A state could hide behind the concept of national sovereignty to commit mass murder with total impunity.
Exactly. Lemkin spent decades trying to formulate a legal framework to address this. Finally, in 1944, deeply influenced by the fate of the Armenians and the ongoing horrors of the Holocaust, he published a book where he coined a brand new term. He combined the Greek prefix geno, meaning race or tribe, with the Latin suffix side, meaning killing. He created the word genocide.
It is incredible to think that the very vocabulary we use to describe the ultimate crime of the 20th century was birthed directly from the ashes of 1915. And for the survivors scattered across the globe, preserving the memory of that crime became their central unifying focus.
The modern Armenian diaspora was built on the imperative of remembrance. Separated by oceans and continents, they utilized culture to maintain their cohesive identity and document their history. The source highlights seminal works like Franz Werfel's novel The 40 Days of Musa Dagh, published in 1933, which actually served as a profound warning against the rise of Nazism in Europe.
And early cinema played a huge role, too. There was a highly successful 1919 silent film called Ravished Armenia, starring a real-life survivor, Aurora Mardiganian, which brought the visual horror of the deportations to American audiences. And, of course, the establishment of April 24 as the global day of remembrance, uniting the diaspora annually.
Now, as we transition into the legacy of recognition, we are entering the section of the source that deals explicitly with competing historical narratives. And I want to reiterate our fundamental promise to you, the listener. We're going to carefully and strictly neutrally outline the two distinct views presented in the Wikipedia text, exactly as they are written and argued.
Absolutely. We'll start with the position held by the global academic community and several international bodies. How does the text describe this viewpoint?
According to the source, there is an overwhelming academic consensus outside of Turkey. This consensus, supported by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, defines the events of 1915 to 1923 unequivocally as a systematic, premeditated genocide aimed at the total destruction of the Armenian people. The text notes that this conclusion is supported by extensive, corroborating documentation found in the state archives of Germany, Austria, the United States, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, alongside thousands of contemporaneous eyewitness accounts. Politically, the source notes that as of 2025, 34 sovereign nations, alongside the Holy See and the European Parliament, have formally recognized the events as genocide.
Conversely, the text details the official, deeply entrenched position of the Republic of Turkey, a position that is supported by the vast majority of Turkish citizens today. What is the foundation of their argument?
The Turkish government vehemently rejects the term genocide. Their official narrative maintains that the mass relocation of the Armenian population was a legitimate, necessary security measure taken by a sovereign state to combat an armed existential threat during a multi-front global war. They argue that while tragic deaths occurred due to disease, starvation, and rogue local violence, there was absolutely no centralized intent or premeditated plan by the Ottoman government to exterminate the Armenian people. Therefore, they argue, applying the legal term genocide is factually and legally incorrect.
The source also dives into how fiercely the Turkish state defends this narrative. It states that the government perceives any open discussion or recognition of the genocide as a direct threat to Turkish national security and a fundamental attack on the foundational myths of the republic itself. This has led to decades of strict internal censorship, the prosecution of Turkish scholars who challenge the state narrative, and a massive century-long diplomatic effort to prevent international recognition abroad.
And the text synthesizes how this century-long dispute over a single historical word is not just an academic debate relegated to history departments. It actively, violently impacts geopolitics today. The unresolved legacy of 1915 acts as a constant accelerant in modern conflicts.
Specifically, the text points to the ongoing, highly volatile conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh region.
Yes. In that conflict, which has resulted in the displacement of over 500,000 people, the historical trauma of the genocide is weaponized by both sides. The governments regularly accuse each other of plotting new genocides. And crucially, the source notes that Azerbaijan has firmly allied with Turkey in its campaign to internationally deny the events of 1915, creating a geopolitical bloc united in part by a shared historical narrative.
So we have taken a massive journey today. We've examined the collapse of a multi-ethnic empire, the terrifying bureaucratic logistics of the death marches, the monumental transfer of wealth that built a new nation, the shadowy assassinations in European capitals, and the ongoing, fierce global debate over historical truth. The ultimate question for you, the listener, is why does understanding the intricate mechanics of this deep dive matter today?
Because the events we've unpacked serve as a terrifying masterclass in the absolute darkest capacities of the modern centralized state. It demonstrates exactly how empires fall and how, in their desperate final moments, the anxieties of nationalism can be weaponized into devastating demographic engineering. It proves that the mundane mechanisms of bureaucracy, the coded telegrams, the property deeds, the tax laws, can be just as lethal, if not more so, than bullets on a battlefield. And perhaps most importantly for navigating our modern political landscape, it shows that the battle over historical memory is just as fiercely fought as the wars themselves. How a nation chooses to aggressively remember or systematically forget its founding moments shapes its policies, its legal systems, and its international relations for generations to come.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering detail from the source to mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing the abandoned properties laws, the enormous confiscation of Armenian land and capital that helped fund the new Republic of Turkey. The text notes that the legal battles over these confiscated assets continued well into the second half of the 20th century. But here is the detail that truly stuck with me. In the year 2006, Not 1916, not 1926, but 2006, the Turkish National Security Council issued a ruling. They declared that the land registries and property records from the year 1915 must remain strictly closed and inaccessible to the public. Why? They stated that opening those specific property records would constitute a threat to national security. I invite you to really think about the implications of that. More than a century later, the ghosts of bureaucratic paperwork, the quiet echoes of confiscated deeds and stolen farms, still hold enough power to shake the foundations of a modern state.
It is a profound and chilling reminder that history, particularly unresolved history, is never entirely in the past.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The material is heavy, it is complex, but it is absolutely vital to understand how our modern world was shaped. Keep asking difficult questions, keep digging deep into the primary sources, and always seek out multiple, well-documented perspectives on the past. We'll see you next time.